Bien, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à ce webinaire organisé par le groupe de travail essais cliniques de France Biotech. C'est un webinaire bilingue en quelque sorte, puisque je vais me limiter à faire l'introduction en français. Il y aura peut-être un tout petit peu de français après moi, mais ensuite notre orateur fera la présentation essentiellement en anglais. Donc nous avons le plaisir aujourd'hui d'accueillir la société Informa Pharma Intelligence. Je laisserai nos orateurs Arcadius Galat et Thomas Weeks se présenter eux-mêmes et nous dire quelques mots de la société. Juste un mot d'abord du groupe de travail France Biotech et ses cliniques pour ceux qui ne connaîtraient pas. Donc, c'est un des groupes de travail de France Biotech ouvert à tous les adhérents et sur décision du bureau à d'éventuels non-adhérents, ce qui nous permet, avec cette composition large, de rassembler des promoteurs, mais aussi des institutionnels, des académiques, tout ça dans le but de, en permanence, améliorer l'environnement économique, réglementaire et autres des essais cliniques en France et d'améliorer l'attractivité de la France pour les essais cliniques. Donc, c'est un travail en continu. Voilà, donc je suis moi-même animateur et coordinateur de ce groupe. Je suis également un des vice-présidents de France Biotech. Je m'appelle
Thomas,
Alexandre.
are you there?
Et donc, je passe la parole
Donc,
sans plus
I think we
tarder
lost Alexander.
si vous m'entendez, je passe la parole à Arcadius. Voilà, à vous. Arcadius,
Arcadius?
c'est à vous.
No, no,
Non.
I cannot hear Alexander.
Ah bon, alors on va peut-être passer la parole à... So maybe we'll hand over directly to Thomas, if Thomas, you can hear me.
Okay, I can definitely hear you.
For some reason.
Let me
But
share
can
my
you hear me?
screen.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Arcadius, would you say a word then? Well, otherwise, maybe we'll leave it to you, Thomas, to start.
Yeah.
Is it me actually? Because sorry, I cannot hear actually. All right. Alors, bonjour chers adhérents invités, petite partie en français. Je souhaiterais tout d'abord me présenter. Je m'appelle Arcadius Galat. Certains parmi vous probablement me connaissent déjà. Pour ceux qui se demandent d'où vient ce prénom, je suis polonais, amoureux de la France. Je suis diplômé de la Sorbonne et l'École normale supérieure, promotion 2006. Je suis responsable du développement commercial d'Informa Pharma Intelligence pour la France. Donc, du coup, le premier point de contact pour toutes les sociétés françaises. Nous sommes très heureux d'organiser ce webinaire en partenariat avec France Biotech, dont nous sommes d'ailleurs un membre associé depuis cette année. Je tiens à vous remercier d'avoir accepté notre invitation pour cette session. C'est une occasion absolument unique de présenter non seulement notre société, mais aussi de démontrer notre expertise métier à l'audience française. Pour ce premier webinaire que nous organisons, nous avons décidé de nous focaliser sur la problématique de la complexité de la divulgation des résultats des essais cliniques avec l'arrivée évidemment du CTIS, le nouveau système d'information européen sur les essais cliniques. L'objectif de cette session est de vous donner une sorte d'aperçu des tendances et des défis actuels en matière de divulgation des résultats, y compris le début des inspections de conformité et l'impact de ce nouveau système sur les sociétés françaises. Les exigences de divulgation, ce que nous voyons maintenant, ne cessent d'augmenter avec une moyenne de 2 nouveaux registres d'essais ouverts chaque année depuis l'année 2000. Les sociétés biotech, mais aussi les grosses sociétés pharmaceutiques sont confrontées à la même plus ou moins complexité croissante chaque année, bien évidemment. Je vous remercie donc de participer à cette session et de nous donner l'occasion de vous présenter tout simplement comment Informa Pharma Intelligence peut vous aider durant cette année des transitions. L'agenda aujourd'hui couvrira les points suivants. Pour commencer, je vais vous présenter en quelques mots Informa Pharma Intelligence. Ensuite, Tom Weeks, qui est notre expert dans le domaine réglementaire, va couvrir le point de 2 à 6. La présentation devrait durer environ 35-40 minutes. Après, nous allons garder une quinzaine de minutes afin de répondre à vos questions. J'espère qu'il y en aura beaucoup. À noter que le contenu de la présentation est en français, mais Tom va couvrir sa partie en anglais. Très bien. Donc, Informa Pharma Intelligence est une entreprise du FTSE 100, qui est l'équivalent du CAC 40 français. Société cotée à la Bourse de Londres avec 10 000 collaborateurs, un chiffre d'affaires aux alentours de 1,7 milliard de livres sterling. Nous sommes le leader mondial dans le domaine d'intelligence, spécialisant dans le secteur pharmaceutique. Notre champ d'expertise va des données cliniques en passant par l'analyse de marché et conseil en opérations cliniques et conseil stratégique. Par conséquent, nous sommes le partenaire, on peut dire, privilégié des grandes sociétés pharmaceutiques, mais aussi des startups, des spin-offs, des sociétés biotech qui démarrent leur phase clinique. Nous trouvons que nos données marché, notre technologie de pointe, mais aussi nos compétences et notre vaste expertise nous donnent dans le domaine sont des valeurs ajoutées nous permettant de fournir des résultats tangibles à nos clients. Slide suivant, Thomas. Merci. Alors, nous accompagnons nos clients à chaque étape du cycle de vie des médicaments et des dispositifs médicaux, c'est-à-dire dans le domaine clinique, réglementaire et commercial. Nos 400 analystes et consultants et environ à peu près 60 journalistes, dont la plupart sont titulaires d'un doctorat, fournissent des analyses, des rapports et conseils dans ces trois domaines, dans ces trois dimensions. Voilà, donc c'est en quelques mots, voilà le résumé d'Informa Pharma Intelligence. Et sans plus attendre, je passe la parole à mon cher collègue Thomas. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, maybe just one word, if I may, just for the final slot for questions. Please feel free to ask all your questions during the presentation on the chat space that you have on the right margin of your screen, preferably in English, but if it's in French, we will translate, no worries. Sorry for stepping in again. Over to you,
No, absolutely. That's a great introduction. And I apologize to the attendees that my French is horrible, so I shall do this in English. Just to start off the discussion, I had a look at the members of France Biotech to see where trials are being conducted. And so these are the data from the CTIS system, the EU clinical trial registration. And you can see that the members of France Biotech are conducting trials all over Europe and also really across the world in virtually all the countries. Now, I think what's important about this is data from clinicaltrials.gov. What's important about it is each one of these small little markers that you see showing up represent a new clinical trial registry. So you can see that in virtually every country in which trials are being conducted by members of France Biotech, there are clinical trial registries that where data are made publicly available. Some are mandatory and some are voluntary. But you can see that this is a global issue. Now, we'll talk more about some of the European specific issues in a second, but I just wanted to give this global overview of your membership to kind of see where things are being disclosed. So as we continue on, let me just make sure that I remind myself to be on time. Sorry. The disclosure started really in about the year 2000 when in the US clinicaltrials.gov went live, which is the registry in the US. In Europe, the clinical trial application process was starting to be managed in the CTIS system in May of 2004. So since then, there has been some public availability of data in Europe as well. And there are many countries in Europe and around the world where there are additional registries. All of this started with the disclosure of the summary of the protocol. So clinicaltrials.gov and others, an extract from the CTA, which is very similar to the protocol registration that goes on in Europe. Then starting in about 2005 in the States, the state of Maine in the United States required the disclosure of clinical results in an ICHE3 format, a study synopsis format. That has been replaced, of course, by other results disclosure requirements, but other countries still require this study synopsis, results synopsis. Then we had what we call them tabular results or summary results. These are the results that you are submitting to UDRA-CT, to clinicaltrials.gov and other registries. And in the beginning, this started off with only approved product. So only approved products required results. Then when we went on in 2010 through policy 43 in Europe, the complete clinical study report had to be disclosed upon qualified request. So once your product was approved, anyone could request the CSR and other documents. And if they had a qualifying reason, then that data were shared. Of course, that has now expanded through policy 70 and through the EU clinical trial regulations, really to public disclosure of a lot of this information without a qualified request. It's just publicly available. Starting in 2014 in Europe and now in the States as well, results had to be disclosed even for unapproved products. So there's no way around that now for all trials that fall under the regulations. So in the States, that's phase 2, 3, 4 interventional trials with locations in the US or where the product was manufactured in the US. In Europe, it's phase 1 through 4 that has to be disclosed results, except phase 1s are not made publicly available if they are only adults in the trial and it is not part of a pediatric investigation plan. In the States, we now also require the disclosure of the protocol and the statistical analysis plan as part of the results disclosure process. And of course, we know that with the EU clinical trial regulation going into application in January, the other information that is going to be expanded. So now we need a plain language summary. Some people call it lay language summaries. We have learned from patient groups that the English term lay is not preferred because it sounds dismissive. So they prefer plain language summaries. The IMPD, except for the quality sections. And then ultimately, sometime, we're not sure if it's 2024, but part of the EU regulations is the disclosure of anonymized patient data. It's sometime in the future, it's anticipated, but they haven't quite decided how that will be managed. So you can see that it's continuing to grow the scope of disclosure. So when we think about how does that continue to grow, really what we're looking at is the compliance and the scrutiny around that. So we have this growing requirement for disclosure. And now inspections have started. Historically, there were no inspections. There were virtually no consequences for non-compliance, except that you were non-compliant with regulations. But with the launch of the EU clinical trial regulations in January of 2022, there's an expectation that the EU member states, the EU health authorities, will start their inspection regime. It's not 100% clear to me how that will happen. Before Brexit, the UK health authority inspected compliance as part of the pharmacovigilance inspection. So the qualified person for pharmacovigilance, the QPPV, had to defend the compliance audit. It's possible that the same thing will happen with the other EU member states that remain in the EU. France and Denmark have already made some announcements about their thoughts on sanctions. Roughly 10,000 euros is sort of the norm, but other countries may have other decisions, and it may be, we've heard some plans or thoughts that some of it might be similar to violations of quality and pharmacovigilance reporting requirements, which would be a meaningful fine. That would mean probably based on the global annual revenues of the product that is non-compliant, which can be very, very significant. So it's high risk, even if it's not yet very likely that it happens. In the States, after 20 years, the FDA finally started inspections and enforcement. That led this year to 3 so far. Notices of non-compliance. Those are made public on clinicaltrials.gov and on the FDA websites. About another 60 pre-notifications of non-compliance have been issued, which caused those companies to disclose the data immediately. That is part of a bioresearch monitoring inspection in the States. So yeah, it led, as I said, to the first public notice in April, but it's continued since then. The other thing that we expect to change, you may have heard that President Biden has nominated Rob Califf to be the new FDA commissioner. And he is very interested in clinical trial disclosure. He has collaborated with the Good Pharma Scorecard, the Bioethics International, Dr. Jennifer Miller, on articles. He's written about the lack of disclosure and the need for more transparency. So if he is successful, if his nomination is successful, I would expect a significant increase in inspections and perhaps more around public disclosure. And in the UK, they announced, the bigger announcement was in September of 2021, so a couple months ago, that they now require plain language summaries for all studies that have completed since September 15 of 2021, and results disclosure and so on. And starting in January, that all trials must be made public on ISR CTN, which is the publicly available registry in the UK. Their enforcement action, they will track every study that is conducted in the UK and authorized in the UK. If you are non-compliant, they will, the one sanction they have discussed is that the ethics committee will not allow future disclosure, future trials to be conducted in the UK. So that can be quite a difficult situation if you are excluded from running clinical trials in the UK. And everyone is looking at this. So these are examples of 3 different websites that are run by transparency advocates, or you might consider them industry critics. The 2 in the front, you might know the EU trials tracker. That looks at the compliance of results disclosure on UDRA-CT. That is conducted, managed by the same group that also has the FADA trials tracker, which is looking at compliance with the US regulations. In each case, every study on the registry is assessed to see whether it is compliant with the regulation. Non-compliant studies are listed and aggregated by sponsor. So what we know, for example, you can look up Regeneron and they have 100% compliance on the FADA trials tracker and on EU trials tracker. They've done a great job. You can look at your own company and you may find perhaps there are issues. By and large, the members of France Biotech are pretty compliant, however. And it's not just these public registries that are looking, these trials trackers or the Good Pharma Scorecard that are looking. There are articles written around the world. So it's not just in the US that people care. You have articles in France, in China, Japan, Germany. There's sort of a global interest on getting transparency right. And sometimes it's aimed at universities, like the article in l'Histoire, but others are about industry as well. And so this was a quick assessment that I did in general. One thing I've noticed in the past that large pharma companies, by and large, are extremely compliant. And small companies, that's companies with fewer than 25 trials that are publicly listed, tend to be quite non-compliant. And so this is an assessment I did a couple of months ago of the data on UDRA-CT. And you can see that 42% of the trials run by biotech, smaller companies, are non-compliant with results disclosure. The 50 largest sponsors in the world, so the Pfizers and J&Js and Sanofis of the world in general, have about a 4.5% non-compliance rate. The members of France Biotech, it's about 6%. And those studies that are in TrialScope Disclose on UDRA-CT, it's just around 99% compliance or 1% non-compliance. Some of this non-compliance has to do with data limitations on UDRA-CT. You can't distinguish between a withdrawn trial with no patient treated and no results, for example. So and sometimes also many of our customers are, some of our customers are large pharma companies. And when they acquire a biotech that was non-compliant, it takes a little while. So you can see, but overall, the non-compliance is still remarkably large for smaller companies. So it's just kind of showing like these are the other ones that are excluded from the TrialScope platform. But I thought it might be helpful also to think about the life cycle of the data that are being disclosed on on the trial registries in general. Where do those data come from? Because there's a lot that we can do in the beginning to ensure that the data are prepared appropriately. So let me just catch up to this. So what we have in the first instance, a lot of the data come from documents. So the protocol is a prime source, of course, for protocol registration or the clinical trial application that is made publicly available. And for results, a lot of it comes from the clinical study report. So those are key documents. And there are ways of authoring those documents, about thinking about those documents that help subsequent disclosure processes. And then there's systems like the clinical trial management system, SAS, and so on that bring the data in. Those data are brought into commercial disclosure systems like TrialScope Disclose or Atlas. Those are applications that we offer. It could be done by homegrown systems like Excel and SQL or whatever you may have homegrown in the application. And from there, it goes to the trial registries. This is just a subset of the 40 plus registries that exist, but you can see they're really all over the world. But it doesn't end there. The data continue. The same data are also used by, for example, pharma companies that have a trial website. It may be used by recruiters or patient advocacy groups. So it's really important to get this data right, to keep it fresh, and to consider the plain language aspect, rewriting it so that it is easily understood by someone who doesn't have a scientific background. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about the clinical trial information system. Just wanted to give you a very high-level overview. We're not going to go too deep into this. I understand you've had a webinar on this, but I thought maybe I'll give an executive summary of what we are seeing. Excuse me, hang on. So overall, we have the clinical trial information system is going to go into production in January of 2022, on January 31. And with that, we also have the EU clinical trials regulation going into application on January 31, 2022. So this is the older EU CTR that's been around for a long time, but still doesn't apply. The CTIS will replace the current UDRA-CT system. It is used by both the member states, so the health authorities in the EU member states, It's also used by sponsors and so on, and everyone is using that to control the flow of information, to manage the flow of information. And it is the single point of entry for the submission of the clinical trial application dossier, also the communication back and forth between the sponsor, the university, the investigator, and the member states. It is used then to communicate modifications, let's say amendments or the trial status updates. So, things like, let's say, oh, the study has started to enroll in Italy or France, and you need to communicate that change. It's also how you're going to be disclosing results, excuse me, and the submission platform for plain language summaries. And just to let you know what we do in support of the CTIS, we have the rules, the compliance events. So these are the due dates and all of that, so that you can manage your workflows towards compliance with all of these aspects. This is the focus that we're doing for our application. But let's think about a little bit the timeline, the chronology for CTIS. So all of this started with the public decision in July of 2021 that the CTIS system had achieved its goal from the audit perspective. That means that the go live now is in January of 2022, which then brings into effect the EU Clinical Trial Regulation 536 from 2014. For the next 12 months until January of 2023, the use of CTIS is optional. So we recommend that you post at least a study to practice, because once 23 comes along, it will be mandatory. But you may want to think about which study you put out on CTIS for two reasons. One, the disclosure volume increases very, very significantly, the amount of data that is made publicly available. And you will have to write a plain language summary for that. So you may want to think about a longer running study, and maybe, thinking about which is the right phase to put out there at first. But starting in January 23, you must then disclose all this information. By January of 2025, all studies that are still on Udacity and active that have not completed must be migrated to the CTIS system. And sometime in the future, again, we don't know exactly when that is, the second part of policy 70 will go into effect, which will then, of course, be replaced by the EU CTR, which has to do with the disclosure of anonymized patient data. The challenge is, and as we might expect, the implementation of CTIS was delayed quite a lot. And in order to make the deadline, the go live system is a little bit more modest. It has some limitations. So first, there's some limited functionality. Initially, the functionality is limited to those capabilities that were required to pass the audit in July. So that was kind of the main thing. It's like, what's the least they can do and pass the audit? A challenge for everyone with systems is that document uploads and data entry must be done only on the website. There is no API, there's no ability to upload from another system. It all has to be done through the portal. And there's no interface for content uploads from sponsor systems. Then there's limited public information. So the EMA has provided limited detailed information about the initial functionality. So it's a little hard to understand exactly what the full scope of everything is, and really limited information about what's happening next. So the API interface, which is a way for us to interact with systems. And then finally, there is no access to a test system. This is really important for anyone developing their own applications, anyone wanting to do some in-house training. ClinicalTrials.gov, for example, offers a test platform that is not available. So it's a little harder to validate solutions that you might be building. And so we'll have to see how that develops. There is a training system, and it's unclear whether the access to that will be opened up more. Right now, it is for what they are calling master trainers or trainer that are being that have taken a course authorized by the EMA. So it's a more limited access. But I think it might also be helpful to compare the capabilities of UDRA-CT and the clinical trial information system. So in the current application, you must submit an application and seek approval from each country's regulatory authority individually. So if you're trying to run a trial in France or Germany or Italy, you're submitting the CTA through the UDRA-CT system directly to that health authority and communicating with them. In the future, of course, that will all be done through a single application for all member states concerned, which includes then, of course, the ethical and scientific evaluation. Right now, you must seek approval from each country's ethics committee individually. In the future, you'll not need to do that anymore. It'll be the local ethics committee application and opinions. Communication regarding the submissions is specific to each country. So in the traditional system, you are having a communication with the health authorities back and forth, but each separately. But in the future, this is done through the CTIS platform only. There's no emailing, there's no separate outside of the system communication. This is all done through the central platform. Currently, also the assessment procedures and deadlines, like how long do the health authorities take, how long do you have to respond to them, is different from country to country. But in the CTIS system, you can be denied ongoing review of existing applications, significant modifications, and so on. So everything has to be done within the member state. And so you have to be careful how you manage that. It's all through a single path. Then the timing of response to requests for RFI vary across EU member states. And that is no longer the case. It's all fixed. And so you must respond to requests for information and questions from the health authorities within 12 calendar days. So it's a much tighter timeline potentially. And the last one is that currently you are able to amend protocols and add trial sites and so on at countries at any time, independent of ongoing applications. So if you submit an application, currently you can submit an amendment before the application is fully processed. In the future, amendments have to be done sequentially. So you can't have multiple amendments going in. So you have to be more careful about managing the timing of amendments so that it's done sort of one at a time. And then finally, the other thing that is different is there is a very tight timeline. So in order to, the EU member states must be informed through the CTIS system within 15 days when a study starts enrolling in a member state. So the first time a site in Portugal is enrolling, let's say on April 1, within 15 days, you have to submit that enrollment status change to the CTIS system. When the first patient visit occurs in a member state, the recruitment ends in a member state. So there's all these data. I won't read them all, but you can see that there is a number of changes to the study and milestones that are achieved that must be communicated quickly. And even faster are urgent issues. So within 7 days, so when you have urgent safety measures, or if you're aware of a serious breach, those must be disclosed within 7 days through the system. And that really is the question: are your systems and processes that you have today adequate to disclose this information that quickly? Because you have to collect the information from your local affiliate, from your CROs, from the sites. You have to make sure it is the good quality data, and then you have to submit it to the CTIS system all within 15 days. These are perhaps exceptions. The 7 days are more emergency. You may have systems for that. but it's something to think about. And so when you consider, some of the considerations having to do with these regulations are that, sorry, let me just get myself up to speed here, sorry. Considerations. So virtually all documents, and I'll show you what that includes in a minute, are going to be made public at some point. Everything you submit to the CTIS system, virtually everything will be made public. Modifications process are done sequentially, so that's something that's a change that you have to accommodate into your system. And you can request deferrals of information, but you have to do those at the time that you do the initial CTA submission. Otherwise, they will be rejected and you will run out of time. And they will, so you have to think beforehand what you want to delay. And just to give you a sense of what are the data that are being disclosed. So the characteristics of the trial, so, a summary of the protocol information, notifications that occur during the trial will be made public. Any of these RFIs, the requests for information, and your responses, those will be made public. Of course, the results and the plain language summaries, the full protocol, the subject information sheet, that's kind of part of the leaflet that you give to the participants, the investigator brochure, and the full dossier of the medication, the safety and efficacy sections at least. So it's a pretty broad disclosure of information. Oops, sorry, I went a little bit fast. And so in kind of the next steps that you may want to consider, and we will share these slides. If you find them useful, we'll give you a PDF. So we don't have to go through everything here, but really the whole thing is plan well in advance about the information that you need to submit before the trial is approved. Simplify as much as possible the number of protocol amendments. Again, it makes it easier. It might be easier said than done, but think through the process because it cannot be parallel. It has to be sequential. You may need to update your SOPs, your standard operating procedures and processes for data collection. That might require you to change contracts with your CROs for more speedy, high quality data submission of, let's say, enrollment status changes. You probably will need to automate some of this process to collect the data and disclose it as quick as possible. We also recommend collaborating across the organization with departments, clinical operations, legal, medical writing, procurement, and so on, before and during the protocol review, and consult on regulatory guidance where applicable. So there's glossaries and so on, and I think sort of at a high level, this is a good way to think through what you need to do next. And then to give you a sense of what we're doing, so in our first phase, which we've already implemented, we are in our systems supporting the workflows to make sure that our customers are compliant with the deadline set by CTIS, the CTIS application. We are working on, in early 2022, the full data collection. We're still, we were waiting for the XML structure of the data so we can incorporate that into our system. We're expecting in early 2023 that the EMA will make it clear what kind of results format they want beyond the study synopsis. And so we will support that then. And eventually, again, we don't know exactly when that is. We're hoping that the EMA will announce their application interface so that we can automate the upload and release and exchange of data. So that's how we are thinking about it. And when you're building systems or looking at how you want to automate this, that might be your roadmap as well at a high level. And then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about disclosure support. I'll really be aware of our time here. The way we support that, so TrialScope, we have been working with sponsors since 2007 on clinical trial disclosure. We support 40% of all industry trials on UCT, so we have services around that. We have Atlas, which is a platform to automate the disclosure assessments to say, when do I have to disclose data and on what registry? Then, of course, we have the the disclosure as a service. That's a full end-to-end services and systems, and then TrialScope Disclose, which is a full feature disclosure system. That's kind of how we work. The services that we offer is we have an audit. So if you want to see how compliant are you, we offer that. Reviewing the policy assessments and processes. That's something else we can do to make sure that if you follow your SOPs, you are compliant, and help you set up an operating model to make sure that you have the right systems and the right users in place. I'm going to skip over this. I just want to be careful with time, but I've included a case study here as well for you to look at a smaller biotech. So this is not just systems for big companies. So these are organizations with fewer than 25 trials. They found that they were non-compliant with regulations, and that while it's heavily regulated, they simply didn't have the visibility and the controls they needed. And it was difficult to manage the complexity of global disclosure. And we implemented a system for them. The owner of that application sort of said that he went from a frown to a smile. They're fully compliant. They've automated all of this. They've been able to reduce their reliance on vendors, on service providers to do disclosure. So that's a great way to accelerate things. And I will skip over this, but just to show you the range from large to small companies that work with us on these items. As I said, we manage over 80,000 clinical trials in our applications with 12,000 users, an overall compliance rate of over 99%. And then the last thing I'd like to do is, and I'll turn it over to Arkadiusz again in a second here, is offer the members of France Biotech an audit. And what we can do is we can look at the data that you have disclosed previously on clinicaltrials.gov and on EudraCT to see whether you are compliant with the disclosure regulations, and we can highlight potential issues. So that's something that my colleague Arkadiusz can manage with you. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I hope you found this useful. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, so we do have a few questions. Let me start maybe by this one. Do you confirm that data from trials run outside the EU do not require disclosure on CTIS, even if the sponsor is based in the EU?
It depends on the trial. So if, let's say you are a French biotech running a trial in Japan only, not in France, then typically you don't have to disclose it in France also, or on EudraCT or CTIS, unless the trial is part of a pediatric investigation plan or is a pediatric study. Then you must, but otherwise no.
Okay, thank you. Other questions. In the new guidelines issued by the EU, there's a recommendation that the sponsors should consider and plan the disclosure at the early stage of the study. So the question is, what are the best practices for incorporating the disclosure for small biotechs that start planning their studies?
Yeah, I think you have to understand that, as you saw earlier, almost everything that you submit to the European health authorities will be made public at some point. So the two things you have to consider: how are you writing your document? And I have a separate, fairly long presentation. If you want, we can set something up for your medical writers about how to write the protocol and the CSR so that they anticipate disclosure requirements and redaction. The other part is don't underestimate, the work to apply for deferrals. So some trials, especially phase 1 trials without pediatric participants, the data disclosure can be deferred by up to 7 years, depending on the type of trial. But you have to apply for that right at the beginning. So those are two things to really consider. And I would say coordinate with your publications group, your regulatory affairs group, and the colleagues who are disclosing on other registries, because the one thing that we do see is that if you are disclosing something on the US or in the UK and you're not disclosing it in Europe, you will get questions. Why are you hiding data from European citizens that you are sharing with US citizens?
In the same vein, maybe a next question. As a small biotech, we will only be running a small number of trials, and the EU and US are the most relevant markets for us. Once we are compliant in those regions, is that sufficient?
Only if you're not running trials elsewhere. Yeah. So I would say there is a cost to getting it wrong. So let's say most of your trials are EU and US. Remember that even in the EU, you have some additional mandatory registries. So if you're thinking about running a trial in Spain, in Germany, in Austria, in Portugal, you may have additional disclosure requirements depending on the type of trial and the kind of information that has to be disclosed. But if you are non-compliant, this can have very serious consequences. So there's two costs to disclosure, which happens especially with smaller biotechs. Because they tend not to have the systems of control. So one consequence, which we have seen, a CRO disclosed trial information in Japan, but did not coordinate with the company what information they take out of the CSR and the protocol to make publicly available. Is it Japan or China? Anyway, they disclosed it, and the biotech, the pharma company in this case actually, could not file a patent in Canada for an indication because the data was made public before there was a patent filed. Of course, that can be disastrous. The other thing to think is that for many smaller companies, one of their exit strategies, how they make money in the end for the investors and for the executives especially, is to be acquired by a large pharma company. And non-compliant disclosure can cause you to be stuck in what in English it's called the due diligence process. I don't know what the French term for that is.
We used to say due diligence as well.
So one of our customers, for example, made an acquisition of a biotech, and they were non-compliant with disclosure, and that stuck the acquisition in the due diligence process for many months. And of course, if you're stuck, if they're looking and saying like, oh, you're not compliant here, which is easy to find, where else are you not compliant? And if you're not compliant, what does that do to your valuation? So it can cost you a lot of money, a lot of nerves and energy, even if there are no fines. So I would say you need to understand your obligations for every country in which you're running a trial, and non-compliance can have very serious consequences, even if there are no fines. Sorry, that was a long answer for a short question. I'm sorry.
Very clear. Thanks, Thomas. And with my lawyer hat, I can only agree. Another territorial scope type of question. If the trial is running only in Japan, should the biotech with headquarters in France disclose everything on CTIS?
I don't think you can, unless it's a pediatric study. Because CTIS is not like clinicaltrials.gov or ISRCTN, where you can voluntarily disclose anything. Right, so you may volunteer to disclose an observational study on clinicaltrials.gov. You may volunteer to disclose a phase 1 study on ISRCTN publicly. CTIS is intended for trials that must get approval by the European health authorities. I don't think there's a concept of voluntary disclosure.
Thanks. In your opinion and experience, what kind of CTIS user management approach best suits an organization with less than 20 new trials per year? I refer to the trial and organization-centric approaches, but also to relationships with CROs.
Yeah, it's going to take a big rethink away from the local affiliate process that you may have to a central regulatory function within your European regulatory affairs group. I think you need to start controlling that, just because the volume of data disclosure is going to increase even before the product is approved. So you need to have a central command and control for this. I think it might be an opportunity for small biotechs to think about implementing a disclosure system and disclosure processes, and maybe even a disclosure department, where until now they said it's not worth having an FTE, it's not worth managing. I think this is the time to manage it. And if you're too small for a FTE, you may want to outsource it. So there are vendors. We do this, for example. We can help you with that as an outsourced function. But in any case, allowing it to be managed only by local affiliates, I don't think is going to work.
Thank you. Next question. To protect commercial information, would it be possible to submit in CTIS a confidential version with the version for publication for the clinical protocol, for example?
Up to a point, yes. There's the sort of the disclosure version, and then the general version, the full version that is submitted. But everything will be made publicly available within a certain time frame. In the presentation, which I've shared at the very end, a slide that we didn't look at today is the deferral timelines, highly summarized. I tried to simplify it a little bit. I took it from my colleague from who published this in Pink Sheets, but it's a simplified table from the deferral options. But in the end, everything will be made public, so please be aware of that.
Absolutely. Next one is probably more a comment than a question. Compliance is not an option right from the beginning. The quality management system should be robust enough to reflect all what is said very clearly today. So it ends with a compliment. Other question that we had.
Sorry. Well, I just wanted to sort of reiterate something that I've been in this disclosure space now for 14 years. And in the beginning, it was only the big pharma companies that really took control. And the smaller companies, they said, well, no one's checking. We can get away with it. It's too much trouble. It's too much confidential information. But the truth is you have no choice. You must be compliant with regulations. The idea is, what happens if we're non-compliant? Well, you're non-compliant with regulation. And by most of you, that's a policy violation. So, and now they are people controlling too, right? So you'll have inspections starting. But yeah, whoever made that point, yes, you must think about disclosure and quality from the very beginning. And there are actually benefits to doing this right. Benefits to patient recruitment, benefits to reducing the effort of subsequent documents because they're all well controlled. So, sorry, I interrupted you. You had a question for me. Sorry.
No problem. Actually, you've just replied the next one, which was, we understand that inspections are starting, but what are the consequences of non-compliance? I think.
So the consequences, first you have fines, like in the States, $12,000+ per day per study. That's the maximum fine. I think France was saying 10,000 euros. In the UK, you won't get ethics committee approval, but you can also lose patent. You can miss the opportunity of an acquisition, either selling your product or your company. So there are real consequences that have already happened and some that are threatened.
Very clear, thanks. Next question. You mentioned patient recruitment as a positive impact on disclosure. Can you elaborate on this? How can disclosure impact our recruitment?
Yes, so it's indirect, but two things. One, I would say, consider disclosure in your protocol authoring, especially because you are allowed on the registries to include things in plain language. So the brief title, the description, some of the inclusion-exclusion criteria can be written in plain language, which is then easily understood by potential participants. The truth is they're not necessarily going to clinicaltrials.gov to look at studies there, or UDRA-CT or UCTR or anything. It's not ideally patient-friendly. But if you have a significant illness or an interest, you might go to patient advocacy groups, and they are pulling data from these registries as well. And the better the quality of the disclosure, the more likely it is that they can recommend this trial for those potential participants. And of course, you have many companies now that have trial websites. So like Moderna we built a trial website for Moderna, for example, and you can imagine through the COVID, people were very interested in what Moderna was doing, and they enrolled a large number of minority participants, which was very difficult to do for the COVID trials, through our recruiting platform, which was pulling data that was also used for disclosure. So there's kind of this back and forth handoff.
Mm-hmm. Other question, do you think these very strict additional regulations will prevent some small biotech from starting new trials in the EU?
It's possible. I mean, I think you do need to think about your strategy. There's been a drop-off in phase 1 studies in some countries because they are required to disclose phase 1 studies. In the US, you're not. Right? So there's some question around, where do you conduct your trials based on disclosure requirements? Now, it's still the ethically right thing to do is to disclose data, even if there are no regulations. But if your company's culture is to minimize disclosure, then you may need to start thinking about the world of disclosure requirements, though you may want to be very careful about how far you go with that so that you're not creating the impression that you are hiding data, or especially exporting the risk of clinical trials to the third world countries, which tend not to have disclosure requirements. But that can look pretty bad, right?
Thanks. Another question. Where can I go today in order to see the disclosed information on past trials?
Well, they're publicly available on the registries that exist. So clinicaltrials.gov, EudraCT, or the EU CTR portal, they disclose the data publicly there, or trial websites, if that was the question.
Any risk that the disclosure conflicts and put at risk with the intellectual properties of a small biotech?
Yes. It means you may have to file a patent earlier. Right, so that, because you must disclose certain things. An example of this, one thing I would say, in the States, all secondary outcomes endpoints must be disclosed. You don't have the option of doing only key, which then means people can drop secondary endpoints that they want to keep private. That is not allowed in the US. But you don't have to disclose other or exploratory or tertiary, whatever you call these endpoints. So think through about how you're writing your protocol. An example, Boehringer Ingelheim, and I say this only because they spoke publicly at a conference about this, a few years ago said they had a policy that a study may not have more than 5 secondary endpoints unless you get approval from the chief medical officer, which you will not receive. Right? So has not because of disclosure, mostly because it's very expensive to run so many secondary endpoints, but it is part of your disclosure process as well.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think we only have 1 minute left, so would you like maybe to have a word of conclusion, and or Arkadiusz maybe?
Yeah, maybe I'll turn it over to Arkadiusz for the offers and so on. Or I can talk. It's just the as a follow-up, we wanted to offer, again, an audit. So let me just share my screen one last time so you have
the context. Please go ahead, Thomas.
There we go.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Do you see? Oh, do you see my slide there? There's the contact information.
No, he's speaking. It's working, but we don't hear it.
We see that. Perfect. And I think you kindly authorized us to share the slides, right?
Yes, of course.
Okay. All right, then we are sharp on time, so I would like to thank both of you very much for this very insightful and informative information on the subject and your offer for pharma intelligence in pharma. So thanks again for your insight, Thomas and Arkadiusz. If you here speaking to the audience, if you would like to join the clinical trial working group, si vous voulez rejoindre le groupe de travail essais cliniques, n'hésitez pas à vous manifester auprès de l'équipe. On a notre prochaine et dernière réunion de l'année mardi prochain le 30 novembre. Donc, c'est pile le bon moment. Merci à tous. Bonne journée et à très bientôt. Thank you. Bye-bye.